Today's topic is bad writing advice. If you've got 5 minutes, I've got 5 tips to help you deal with 5 crazy bad pieces of writing advice. There's an awful lot of information out there for wannabe writers. There are bloggers, there are Instagrammers, there are TikTok videos, and there are YouTubers like me giving you some advice on how to write. And there are lots of pieces of advice that keep popping up from time to time, and new writers keep quoting. Sometimes they're misinterpreting those pieces of advice, which makes them crazy bad pieces of advice. Today I want to share with you 5 bad pieces of advice that can be reinterpreted to work for you. Here's tip number 1 for piece of advice number 1. Write what you know. I'm sure you've heard this before. I'm sure you've read it. I'm sure that many people have told you that if you don't know about something, you can't write about it. The way they're interpreting this piece of advice is that if you haven't experienced everything that you're going to write about in your book or your article or your blog piece, then you can't possibly write about it. That's not really true. There are different ways of knowing about things, and only one of those ways of knowing has to do with personal experience. That's called empiricism. The empirical way of knowing things is to observe them yourself or to experience them yourself. However, if that's all we ever wrote about, there wouldn't be things like historical fiction, for example, because not one of us has lived in a period of history that we're writing about. So there is a grain of truth in this particular piece of advice, and it has to do with accuracy, and it has to do with representing things the way they really are. And one of the ways that you can do that, for example, is to use research. Recently, I was writing about the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris, and I've been there, but it's been a lot of years since I've been there, and I needed to find out what kind of shops were on that street now in Paris. So I went on to Google Maps and I went on to the view for the street, and I took a walk down that street online. And I looked here and I looked there and I looked ahead and I looked to the side and I looked at the corners, and I could see what shops were on that street within the last couple of years. That's the kind of thing that you need to know about, and you can experience things in different ways. Bad piece of advice number 2 is work on only one project at a time. Well, good Lord, this just might be the worst piece of advice anyone could ever give a writer. The idea is to focus, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm going to suggest to you that you need to focus on that one piece of writing at a time while you're working on it. It doesn't mean you can't have more than one project going on at the same time. In fact, I would suggest that having more than one project is probably the best way for you to avoid writer's block. When you get to a point in one particular project where you're having a little bit of difficulty figuring something out, put it away, go to the other project, do some work on that. One of the interesting things is there's kind of a synergy between projects, and sometimes one of them will actually inform the other. So don't take this literally. Only focus on one project at a time while you're actually sitting at your desk working, not in general. Bad piece of advice number 3. You must find a writers group. Well, just gag me right now, because as far as I'm concerned, writers groups can be one of the biggest mistakes that a writer can make. One of the things you need to recognize is that a writers group, whether it's in person or it's an online writers group, is a social event. If you need a social event, if you're a person who needs to have people around you, writers in fact might not be the best people to have around. Do people gain something sometimes by writers groups? Yes, I think some people do, but I think there can be more harm than good. There is a problem with spending too much time talking and interacting with other writers and getting feedback from people who don't know anything more about writing than you do, and possibly even less. That's particularly a problem of online writers groups. Be very, very careful. I have done a video before about writers groups, and I think you need to be very careful about the writers groups that you belong to and you interact with. Bottom line is you can waste a lot of time by participating in writers groups. Bad piece of advice number 4 is vary your word choice. Now this is an interesting one because it is easily misinterpreted by writers. Now, do you use a program like Grammarly, for example? Because Grammarly will suggest to you that you should use another word. You've used this word, it's been overused, used a different one, particularly in the same paragraph. The unfortunate thing is, not every word in the English language which means the same thing means exactly the same thing. It's the beauty of our language. We have many words that mean a similar thing, but they're not precise. I recently had a piece of writing that Grammarly told me that I needed to change the word wharf, that I was using it too often. Well, there's a difference between a jetty and a pier and a quay, all of the words that they wanted to suggest that I use in its place. It was a wharf, I stuck to wharf. And the other word that is often problematic here is when there's a suggestion that you should, in dialogue, not always use the word said. Well, the fact is that said is a very good word that blends into the background, as long as you don't use that tag too often, but it is much more amenable to reading using words like argued, yelled, whispered, interjected. Just use said most of the time. And tip number 5 is one you've probably heard a lot. Kill your darlings. Or murder your darlings, however you want to hear it quoted. And it's been variously attributed to a number of people, from Oscar Wilde to William Faulkner and even to Stephen King. Oh, and also Allen Ginsberg recently, of course, because of the movie by the same name. However, many scholars point to a different origin. They point to British writer Sir Arthur Quiller Crouch, who wrote a book about writing, On the Art of Writing, which was published in 1916. And this particular passage has been misinterpreted by writers ever since. What he was suggesting was that when you do your editing, you should do it without sentiment, without emotion. In other words, you should look at things as objectively as you possibly can to determine whether or not a piece of writing fits and works and is necessary. And just because you love that piece doesn't necessarily mean it stays. However, there are times when you write something and it is so beautiful and you love it and you don't want to cut it, and it works in the piece. Don't cut it. Don't kill your darling, keep it. But if it doesn't advance the scene, if it doesn't do anything for the story, cut it, but don't lose it. Keep track of it, put it in a notebook, and use it again sometime in another piece of writing. And before I go, I have a bonus one for you. I have often heard it said that once you have a first draft, you should cut it in half. This piece of advice does not work for all writers. If you happen to be someone who has verbal diarrhea and just spews out stuff in your first draft, all kinds of anything, and spews it out on the page and adds detail and continues to describe things over and in different ways and puts in every piece of research that you did as that was supposed to be background, and you put it in your first draft, then this probably is a good piece of advice. But if you're like some of us, including me, who has a tendency to write a first draft to get a story down, to get the bones of the story down, then what you probably will end up with in your second draft is a slightly longer story. That's okay. So just ignore that piece of advice. So that's it for me today. Remember that not every piece of advice that somebody gives you is good just because they've put it in a blog or put it on a YouTube video. Talk to you next time. Subscribe to Write, Fix, Repeat, and maybe I can help you improve your writing knowledge and skills, 5 tips at a time.